So I want to say registration begins from 6:30 till 7:30. So I want to say that's what it is.
So yeah, 3,100.
3,100.
I thought it was really good, and the food is good. And
That's not bad.
And
That's really not
delivery
bad.
and setup.
We can talk. We can talk more about that later.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. Good morning.
Morning.
How are y'all this morning?
Good.
Good. Everybody dry off. It was very wet whenever we came in. Did it stop raining?
No, it was
still raining.
It's still raining some. Okay. Yeah. I was drenched getting to the car this morning. So. No, I'm happy with it. I'm very happy about it. Yeah, I'm very happy about it. I'd like it to rain a lot more. It'd be nice if we could somehow get the burn ban turned off by this evening, but I don't think that's going to happen. So,
You need something this evening to burn?
well, no, I would like to burn something this evening.
That's what I
So,
was wondering.
but you said, do I need
Yeah, are you
something?
burning something this evening?
I would like to do a bonfire devo
Oh,
for
okay.
Benjamin's Sinara, but I want to. But there's burn ban, so I can't really do that.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
what is your
Can you not
confusion?
do it like in a ring or something like that either?
Can you not get like a fire pit?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You can.
It's still burning something.
That
Yeah,
doesn't
but
count.
that's
That's not the
not
same.
what they
Does it not?
Yeah,
Are you
that-
sure about
I
that?
am positive.
We have an
Maybe
outdoor
it's like we'll go burn the
fireplace.
pasture.
Yeah.
Well, also, I will say it does seem like it may be raining the rest of the day.
If it's contained.
Right,
If
if
it's
it's contained, you're good.
Is that how that works?
Yeah.
It's not a
Yeah.
permanent structure, so you can put
Correct.
it back in the.
Well, that's what it has to be, is a non-permanent structure.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to talk about permanent structure, but we have a portable fireplace. that
Yeah,
we can just
yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
You're good.
Well, we'll see. Let's look at the weather report, and maybe we'll go from there. But do you have some extra brush we can burn?
It's not wet.
That's not wet?
Do you
Maybe.
want some, I've got some like firewood for.
We'll,
like,
Oh,
we'll
yeah,
see.
we have that.
We'll see what the weather looks
Let me
like.
know if you want.
We'll see what the weather looks like.
But I've got
It'll be bad.
firewood.
May not be a bad thing. We'll talk. We'll talk. All right. Anyway, good morning to all. It's good to see you all this morning. I want to thank Robert again for filling in last week. So I hope that was a good discussion, good class, good discussion.
Basically, two things.
Mhm.
Just talked about the wilderness and some of the background, how they ended up there,
Mhm.
and then talked a little about Moses, who he was, kind
Mhm.
of what his personality traits and things.
Moses he's an impressive dude. He really is. I mean, what he did and put up with was, whew. He is a leader of leaders, and that all leaders could look to as for an example of how to lead.
Except for how he started out.
Except for how he started out. Yeah, I will say that for sure. But I think that's another thing, that's a positive thing for leaders to look at as well, that people,
Humility.
yeah, is humility, not always having to be perfect in that way. I think there's something to that. But yeah, he's just excellent. What he went through is just astounding. So this week, I want to talk about the book of Judges. We want to continue in our study. So last time we had class, I think on your sheets it says last week. It wasn't last week, obviously. It was 2 weeks ago. Well, we talked about the conquest. We talked about the people of Israel coming to that. That's on, correct? That's recording? Okay, good to go. Okay, we talked about the people of Israel conquering the land of Canaan, coming in. Of course, we're talking a little bit about how they were not necessarily able to completely do what they were supposed to do, but they get into the land of Canaan. They were in the promised land at this point, and now we see the book of Judges. This is a very important book because this is before the kings come in. This is kind of this transitional period where they get into the promised land, but yet they don't have great leadership, and so they continually kind of do their thing in the nation of Israel, which is continuously fall flat on their face over and over again. And then God is there to help them in this process. So, as we discussed the last time we were here, Israel was unable to complete the conquest of the promised land. They were unable to do this. And so if we turn to the book of Judges, and we go to chapter 1 towards the end. I don't necessarily want to read this whole section because there's just a lot of names and stuff, but you can see there's a little header, at least in your ESV Bible potentially, chapter 1 verses 27 through 36 of Judges chapter 1. We can see the header should say, failure to complete the conquest. It's very clear from this section, Israel was not able to do what they were called to do, which was to drive out all the inhabitants that were there that had been practicing the unrighteousness and all these things. They were unable to complete the conquest, and this caused problems. And so let's read Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 5 real quick. So turn to Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And Judges, so we've got first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, Judges. So go ahead, Don.
So in chapter 1, verse 28, it said they did not drive them out completely. So I'm taking issue with the word unable. I would put it as unwilling, because with God they were able.
But they did not drive them out completely. I would say, well, maybe unwilling would be fair. So they were unwilling to do that. That's fine. I mean, if you want, I think that's semantics in that way. But sure, I'd say unable or unwilling. Interesting thing to notice here is, as well with this, is that all the people that they were unwilling or unable to drive out from the land, they, instead of driving them out, obviously, they put them to forced labor, which is interesting that a people who had just come from Egypt, where they were in forced labor, then immediately gets into a land, disobeys God, not only first off by not driving out the people from the land, but then puts them under the same bondage that they were in Egypt. I think this is also going against God's will, because God never stated during the conquest that they were supposed to put people in bondage and slavery. This was never supposed to be something that they were supposed to do, but that's what they ended up doing, was they put the people under bondage and slavery. Go ahead.
It reminds me of King Saul, who saved the best of the land that he was supposed to be wiping out completely. He saved it, so they're saving some for themselves.
For themselves, that's correct. Yeah, and like I said, I think it's just terribly ironic in that way, and I would agree with that. I think that the people who were freed from slavery now put people in slavery as soon as they get to a place. Like I said, this just goes completely against what God wanted. And you can see, as Don points out, this seems to completely be from selfish desires. But this is going to cause them problems, because in Judges chapter 2, verse 1 through 5, I'm going to read that now. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you out from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your side, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words, all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. So we see that God promises that their failure would cause them problems, or unwillingness, if you'd like to call it that way. But regardless, they failed to conquer the promised land. They failed to do what they were supposed to do, what God would have allowed them to do. And at this point, their failure would cause them problems, because God had directly promised them that these people and their gods would become a stumbling block and a thorn in their side for the rest of their time in the land, which is something that just continuously happens, not only in the book of Judges, but even later during the reign of the kings. This would also be an issue. This would just continue to be an issue over and over again that would plague them for their entirety of their time in the promised land. That this would be an issue for them. And I think it's interesting as well that they even hear God tell them, you're going to fall into this. I think that would be a challenge for me to say, okay, I'm going to do my best not to fall into this, but then of course they do exactly as God promises that they would do, because God knew what would happen, and they would end up falling because of this. So God's people, they're now in the promised land. They're in the promised land. Promised land. They're in the promised land, or the promised land. But Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 15 will tell us that they are not living like the people of God. So I'm going to read that section real quick as well. Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals, or the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out from the land of Egypt. they went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Asheroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So we see people of Israel, they get into the promised land, this land that God had promised them. This was everything that they had ever hoped and wanted. And they immediately don't follow his commands. I mean, they really start doing this from the failure to do what God called them to do, to drive out the people from among them. But then they start following after the gods of the people, the very people that they were trying to drive out. So they fell into the trap of the people that were already there. The whole reason why God was sending those people out was because of their wickedness, because of their immorality. And so the people of Israel come in to be God's agents of justice to drive them out of the land. And what do? Immediately start doing the exact thing that got the people's past sent out from their land for. And so they start falling in. Go ahead.
Now, these people that are in the promised land,
Mm-hmm. Talking about the Canaanites or the Israelites?
the Israelites,
Yeah.
that are in the promised land at this time,
Mm-hmm.
the land was promised to their fathers,
Mm-hmm.
and they were supposed to give it to them. They didn't see all the miracles that God did
Mm-hmm.
in Egypt,
Mhm.
bringing them out there and through the 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they saw some of them because they were growing up during that 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
but they did not see it. And
They
even though
definitely heard about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure they heard about it, and they didn't listen to God's voice,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not for sure we've done much the same.
Mm-hmm. Are you saying it's a failure on those that came from past generations who saw the things to not pass that tradition along to their children? Is that what you're saying?
No,
Okay.
I'm saying that these younger people that come into the land of Canaan,
Uh-huh.
they have not actually seen a true might of God.
Well, I would say as they're driving out the Canaanites, I would say they've seen God's might in that
Are
way.
they seeing the might of God, or are they thinking that's in themselves?
Well, they're absolutely, but I think those things can be connected, right? Where they see the might of God, but they're not actually giving God the credit for it. They're saying
That's
they're
okay.
seeing God's might, right? But they are saying, "Oh, look what we have done." So I think there's something to that. But yes, there's certainly they are not recognizing God's gifts and what they did for. They're not giving proper credit to God for it. They're instead,
They're not recognizing
Yes.
His sovereign
which
authority.
I think is the failure of peoples throughout history. They constantly look and think themselves to be the reason why all good things are happening in their lives. And then whenever things are going poorly, they tend to look at God and say, "What are you doing?"
Why'd you do that to me?
Yeah, and why would you do that to me? It's like when things are good, it's me. But when it's bad, why have you done this to me?
But that's true with even human to human.
Oh yeah.
That's just.
Oh yeah, whenever things are going well, it's because of me.
But,
But if not, it's you.
Yeah,
Right,
we
yeah.
want to blame somebody
Oh,
else.
absolutely, because that would take real accountability otherwise. So yeah. I
Were
think
they
there's something
much
to that.
different than what the world is today?
Well, I think as Ecclesiastes tells us, there's nothing new under the sun. So I think we have the condition of mankind, regardless of how technology changes, the condition of mankind remains the same. We are all fallen and in sin and in need of a Savior, and so that's why God provided us Christ. And so
Solomon said there's no new thing under the sun.
it's correct in Ecclesiastes. So that's correct. Yep. So that is what I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. So I want to talk about this because when we talk about the book of Judges, this is the core thing we need to remember about the book of Judges is there's this cycle that continuously happens over and over again. If you guys have studied the the book of Judges before, you probably heard somebody explain this. And if not, then I'm going to do that for you today. So the book of Judges is this continuous cycle where there's the beginning of it is the people of God, they disobey. So I think I put disobeyed God. You can either put disobey or disobeyed, either way. So the people disobey God, and then God sends a nation to punish them, right? Punish them. They then cry out to God. They cry out or cried out to God for help. Then God sends a judge to help and deliver them. And things are good and peachy and rosy. And then they disobey again. God punishes them again by sending another nation. They cry out again. He sends another judge. And things are good. They disobey. And it's a continual cycle all the way until the end of the book of Judges. Really until the kings come about. And so there's just this continual theme over and over again. You've got all these different judges. And I don't need to list all of them. I want to talk about a little bit of them. Some highlighted judges that I want to talk about. But this is what I call the Judges cycle, and what a lot of people would call the Judges cycle. We're just continuously over and over again. People fail. God punishes them by sending a new nation in to enslave them captive, keep them captive or rule over them. They cry out to God for help. God sends a judge to help them. They rule over the land for a little bit. Then they start disobeying again, and it just continues over and over and over again. Some of what happens between here and here is sometimes the fault of the judge. Who maybe starts becoming unrighteous in their own right, because the kind of theme that we also see in the book of Judges is there's no kind of perfect judge in that way. Some of you can't really see anything wrong with them because either what's written about them is just very short, or it just doesn't go into that. But some of the ones that get talked about the most, you end up seeing their kind of faults and failures in that way. But a lot of it it's just the people of Israel continually to disobey God, and then God sends punishment, and it just continues over and over again. And we can look at some examples of that this morning, but if you want to look and see more about this for yourself, I'm not going to read the whole passage this morning, but if you read Judges chapter 2, 16 through 23, as I've listed up there, you can see that the author of the book of Judges just spells it out. This is what happens. People disobey, God sends punishment, they cry out, judges sent, delivered, then they do the same thing over and over again. The author of the book of Judges recognizes, okay, this is what you're about to read, and you're going to be like, wow, I've seen this before, because it just keeps happening over and over again. But the author of Judges just said, this is what happens. Go ahead, Denver.
That shows the mercy of God.
I think it absolutely shows the patience and mercy of God. Yeah, that he doesn't, the nation of Israel. You guys talked about this with Robert last week as well. For them to even get into the promised land, God had to be incredibly patient and merciful with them. For him to even have the patience to let them get into the promised land in the first place. And now they get there, they just continue to do this again. Go ahead.
One thing that we talked about, the 10 things that caused them to get thrown into the wilderness. But when we looked at it, in the last 3, you could see where his patience was just. And the last time it was the fire.
Yeah.
Just playing the fire, and he's like, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's incredible. Like I said, the amount of patience and mercy that God has. And if we see the world, we know how much patience and mercy God has, because the fact that he allows us to continue so that some may come to righteousness, as Peter tells us, that's the amount of patience and mercy that God has for human beings to even allow them to continue to exist anyway. Is quite something. So, and I think that's shown in a microcosm within the people of Israel during this cycle over and over again. So let's talk about the judges themselves. If you look in Judges 4 through 5, we'll see the only female judge, and her name is Deborah. And Deborah, people were coming to her. She sat under a tree and gave judgment for people, told them how to improve their lives. She gave good advice to them. And then the day came when she was called upon to help the people to throw off their captors in a military sense, which was kind of interesting because there's Deborah and Barak or whatever you want to call him. It's kind of interesting because he was the one who got called to go into battle and actually defeat the enemy. But he said, I'm not doing it without her. But the story is very interesting because it glorifies women not once but twice, because we're told about Deborah and how awesome she was and how intelligent she was and how people would listen to her. But at the end, we have this account of this this tent wife, Jael, or Jael, or however you want to pronounce it, Jael, I think a lot of people pronounce it as. If you look at verse 17 of chapter 4, Deborah promises that a woman would end up being glorified by at the end of this battle, and that's exactly what happens, because Sisera, which is the commander of the opposing army, he is defeated in battle. He flees. He finds this tent of Jael, this wife of a Canaanite, and the Canaanites and the people that they were fighting were on friendly terms. And so he thinks, oh, I've got an ally here. Please let me come into your tent and keep me safe. And she gives him some milk. He goes to sleep, and then she, being the housemaker that she is normally, she was the one responsible for putting the tent up and taking the tent down, and she knows how to put some tent spikes down, and that's exactly how she ends up killing the commander of the opposing army. Is he's asleep, she takes tent peg, hammer, bam, right through the temple. So she's getting some strength to her, because she's used to doing this continually thing, pulling up the tent and putting the tent back down, and she's used to doing this. And so she, in Deborah's song in chapter 5, is glorified for what she did. So verse 24 of chapter 5, most blessed of women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a noble's bowl. She sent her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She splattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he sank, he fell. He lay still. Between her feet she sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. And so we see, once again, she receives the glory for what is being done here, as was promised by Deborah. I think this is an interesting story, because we don't really get that many stories about women kind of being put in this position, and so I think it's always important when we see these kind of things, whether it be Deborah or Jael or Esther or Ruth or Mary in these instances. I think it's always important that we talk about them. So we see Deborah is the only female judge in this way, and we see what she did in her story. Now, the two judges that have the most written about them, I want to see if you guys know, who are the two judges that have the most written about them, have the longest stories?
Was Gideon one of them?
Gideon is absolutely one of them. Gideon is one of them. Gideon is one of them, and then the other one I think is the most famous of the two of that get written that is written about in the book. The other one is Samuel. He's not technically a judge. He's technically the priest that comes later. But in the book of Judges. It does start with an S, though. He's got some long hair. Samson. There we go. Yes, Samson. Samson. This is the one we like to tell our kids about, right? So this is Samson. He's super strong, and he's got the long hair, and he's got the whole reason why he has this ability is God says that he will take the Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow is threefold. Number one, you can't touch dead things. Number two, you can't drink of alcohol. And number three, you can't cut your hair. So that's the three things that he has to do. Now, interestingly, in his life, he ends up failing in all three things. But it's not until he gets to the last thing that he ends up losing his vow. Because, of course, we know he touches the dead thing whenever he eats the honey from the lion carcass. So he wasn't supposed to do that. That's number one. Number two, at the wedding feast, it talks about how he drank a little bit of alcohol in that way, so he failed in that way. But the last thing, he didn't have his strength taken away until he failed in the last thing, which was his hair. So Samson, very interesting story. He's got a very bad choice in women. So the first wife that he gets, he doesn't want a wife from the people of Israel. He wants a wife from the Philistines at the time. He gets a wife from the Philistines, and he thinks he's smart. He's going to get some wealth from the Philistines that come to the wedding. And he says, this is later on, let me find out where that is exactly. Judges chapter 14 and going forward. Samson makes makes a bet with these people from the Philistines. Hey, if you guess my riddle, I'm going to owe you a bunch of clothing and wealth, and if you can't get the riddle, then you owe me this stuff. And his riddle is, out of the eater came something sweet, out of the strong came something, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet, which of course was him getting the honey from the lion carcass. After a few days, the Philistines realized, hey, we weren't going to be able to get this. They threaten his wife. His wife then gives in and says, okay, this is what it actually is. It's the story that he told me about how he ate this honey out of this lion carcass. And so she betrays him in that way. The Philistines come to him and say, haha, we got you. We got the riddle down. And then he gets mad and he sends foxes with torches on their tails through their camp. And that causes them some issues. And then later on, we see that the Philistines came to him to try to take him down again because they've now got some animosity between the two. Also because of, I believe, his choices earlier in women. And he strikes down 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, which is quite something. So very interesting story with Samson. Now, of course, we know Samson's eventual downfall would also come by his bad choice of women because he sees a prostitute. He likes her. This is a different woman now because the wife that he had was then killed by the Philistines and the father, which is why he destroyed the 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey. New wife he's got now, her name is Delilah. She is a prostitute. So he is with her, a Philistine prostitute, I believe, as well. And the people say, hey, we'll pay you 1,100 pieces of silver if you tell us where his strength comes from. She didn't know where his strength came from either. So he kept telling her, this is kind of the interesting thing. So Samson keeps telling her, yeah, he just keeps doing it. So she asked him, where does your strength come from? And he's like, it's some new ropes. If you get some new ropes and tie me up, it'll be that. She hides people in his house, ties ropes around him while he's asleep. Also a very heavy sleeper, Samson. Like clearly, he's a very heavy sleeper. Ties ropes around him. Then he says, then she says, "Oh Samson, the Philistines are upon you," because she hid them in this house. And then he wakes up, throws off the ropes, kills everybody. And this happens not once, but multiple times. That he tells her, like, hey, oh, it's actually this. Oh, it's actually this. Usually always involves ropes. It's this, it's this, it's this. If you do this, this, and this. And one time it's like if you tie my hair together or something. Because he started getting closer to telling her the truth. And he just kept doing it. Like, if a woman kept doing this to me, I think I'd eventually get the message and be like, exactly, like she's the enemy. I don't get it. But anyway, eventually he gives in because she guilts him enough. Be like, oh, you don't love me, or else you tell me this. Which is the same thing his first wife did about the riddle thing. Obviously, you don't love me enough because you don't tell me these things. So she says, you obviously don't love me enough because you're not telling me. He tells her at that point. Then in the night, she or somebody else cuts off his hair. Regardless, like I said, a very heavy sleeper, Samson. I mean, it must be said. Cuts off his hair. Philistines come upon him. He can't do anything about it. They gouge out his eyes, which is a nice touch, and then they take him to this place where all the Philistines are celebrating together. It's got a bottom floor and a top floor. And all the important commanders and leaders of the Philistine, there's thousands of them that are in this place. Some are on the roof, some are inside. And of course, they bring out their enemy, Samson, who is now, weak and doesn't have vision, to get him to entertain them, to dance around for them, kind of in a way. They can laugh at, oh, look at Samson, now he's defeated. And Samson calls upon the Lord one last time to give him God's strength. And he pulls down the two pillars that's supporting the whole thing, and everything comes crashing down. He kills 3,000 people, including himself, at the end.
His hair did grow out.
His hair did grow out a little bit. The Bible does specifically say after a little bit of time, his hair did grow out a little bit. Whether that's the reason for it or not, God gave him the strength to do it. Pulls down the house, and it falls. And so he's able to kill more Philistines at that point than he ever was in battle, Which is also why, by the way, Samson is the greatest comedian in the Bible, because on his last act, he brought the house down. Boom. There you go. That's my dad Bible joke for the day. Yeah, that's a dad Bible joke for the day. But
so
yes,
God was the one that came and
Yes.
took away.
That's correct.
Because he was thinking I'm undefeatable, and he was just playing around
Oh yeah.
with Delilah, and he eventually told her he still thought he wouldn't be defeated, and that was kind of a lack of faith in God, thinking it was all him. So
It's kind of an interesting show of pride, right? He probably thought, like, oh, well, I was told this, but I already broke the Nazirite vow twice by touching the dead thing and drinking. So why is this the thing that would get me? That's an interesting observation, I think. Yeah, he probably thought to himself, I haven't been defeated yet. I've broken the Nazirite vow twice. Like, why would it be an issue if I did it now?
But it was his lack of faith in God.
His lack of faith, yeah. And he was punished for that, but God did give him the strength whenever he realized that it was God who gave him the strength in the first place when he asked him for it at the end. So that was that. Gideon, also a very interesting story. So we have Gideon, who, this is a little bit further back in the book. We talk about Jephthah too, but Jephthah's...
Need to continue on your personal...
I don't know what that is. So later on, so earlier we've got Gideon. Gideon's story begins in chapter 6 and goes forward. Gideon is called to serve God and to be a man of valor, as it is said in the middle of chapter 6. Called to defeat the Midianites who were oppressing the people of Israel. And he has some issues with faith coming to God originally, because even though the angel of the Lord, as we're told, the angel of the Lord comes to him and tells him that God wants him to serve him, he has some issues believing it at first. So he brings out some food and puts it on a rock, and the angel of the Lord makes all the food disappear, get burned up by this fire that comes out of this rock. It's kind of interesting. But then even then, Gideon's still kind of like, I don't know. So he brings out this sheep's wool and puts it on the threshing floor and says, okay, if it is soaking wet and nothing else and it's bone dry around it, then clearly I know that you want me to serve you. Well, guess what? He gets up the next day, it happens. The sheep's wool is full of dew to the point where he can wrench it out and it fills up a whole bowl, and everything else is bone dry around it. He said, okay, I got you. That sounds good. I want third test, though. I want the opposite to be done. I want the fleece to be completely dry and everything else to be wet around it. Well, guess what? God does that, and finally Gideon's like, all right, fine, you got me. This is 3 different tests. You succeeded. I'm not going to believe the first 2, I believe the third. And so he starts to serve God. So Gideon gets, I think it's 10,000 men originally or something like that. He gets a lot of men together. Yes, and the 10,000 remaining. So he gets a lot of men. But God says, okay, I don't want you to think that you have won this battle by your own might. So I'm going to reduce the amount of men you have. This is too many. I want to make sure people know that this is God who won this battle and not Gideon. So let's reduce your men by a lot, so that he says, the first thing he offers is an out. Hey, if anybody's scared, leave. And a bunch of people leave. But then God says, this is still too many people. I'm going to keep losing it. Oh, there it is. So it went from 22,000 to 10,000, I think. Yeah, and in chapter 7, verse 3, starts at 22,000. He gives the out. 10,000 remain. And God says, this is still too many. Take your men down to the river. Whoever goes down and puts their face in the water to drink, they're gone. But whoever kind of goes down and laps it up out of their hand, they can stay. And there's some people believe that some of this is, based off military tactics, right? Because if you're a military person, you should not drink head first like that, because then where can you see the enemy? You can't, right? You put your hand down and you can drink it that way. I think it just could have just been a test, because God knew that only 300 people would remain after that point. So then the actual battle commences, which is not really a battle. It's Gideon gets his men to circle the camp of the Midianites. They have a trumpet in one hand. They throw pots down and they blow the trumpet. And all the Midianites are scared out of their mind because they hear the trumpets calling and the pots going, the pots breaking, and they think the world's ending. And so they all flee and start killing each other, and all these things happen. And so God kind of delivers the people of Israel again. But really, once again, it is showing that God did it and not human effort that did it. So they were being used as instruments for God's ultimate victory. And we would later see that Gideon would take some of the things that they had won in battle, and he makes an ephod out of it, which is kind of we have the ephod that Aaron had, which was supposed to be like the symbol of his office. Well, Gideon kind of does the same thing, but Gideon does it by kind of putting himself above God at the end, because he was so praised for what he had done that he makes this ephod for himself to be the leader of the people of Israel going forward, which is kind of the end of his story. And he ends up having some issues as well. He dies. His first son takes over. By the way, he's got 70 sons. He's got a bunch of kids by a bunch of different wives, Gideon. But his oldest son, Abimelech, kills all of his siblings, so that way none of them would attain the throne. He ends up judging the people of Israel over them for a little bit, but he's not really a judge because like I said, he kills all of his siblings in order to be the lone leader, and then God punishes him later. And that's when we see a few other judges come about. So those are the two big ones. Jephthah's also written about a bit, but it's not as much as the other two. The one I like talking about this judge because so little is written about him, but I really just appreciate him. Give me 1 second. Is the shortest, the one that has the shortest amount written about him is my guy Shamgar. Shamgar, and I want to read that section really quickly as well. Shamgar, after him was Shamgar. This is chapter 3, verse 31. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. By the way, does anybody know what an ox goad is?
Pointed stick.
It's a pointed stick is really what it is. It's the thing that if you were in the cart, you would be traveling along, and you would use this pointed rod to hit the oxen so that way they would go. It's literally just a pointed stick that they would use to make animals go. That's it. He kills 600 people with this. It's amazing. That's incredible. And he's got one verse. One verse written about him, at least in the Old Testament, because he's also written about it in the New Testament as well.
You know that was God.
Yeah, exactly. You know that was God. He used an ox goad. He used an animal whipping device to kill 600 people. Anyway, go ahead, Don.
What does your version say for 1 Samuel 6:15?
1 Samuel 6:15. And the Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the box that was beside. 1 Samuel 6:15 is what you're looking for. Okay. Okay. And the Levites took down the ark of the 7:15. Okay. And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. Okay.
So it does use the word judge.
Okay. But I'm talking about the book of Judges. We're looking at that. So we're looking at the judges that are in the book of Judges. So we see, like I said, Shamgar. I'd like to talk about him because, like I said, he's got one verse written about him. One verse. He's an awesome dude. So now, all of these judges happen. All these things happen, and then chapters 17 through 21 come into play. And I don't want to read all of these. I can recount some of the stories that happened here. It's bad, though. I'm talking real bad, especially if you talk about verses, chapters 19. Oh, chapter 19. It's horrible what has happened to the people of Israel, because what happens is there's a Levite who has a wife, and his wife is a concubine, so a prostitute in this way. He's got a wife, and she runs away from him to her father-in-law's. He chases after her. The father-in-law's like, "Oh, you should stay and stay with us for a few days and eat and drink and be merry and all that stuff." Then they leave to go back to where he's from, the Levite is from, and they have the option to either stop at a Jebusite city, which is of course not the people of God, right? A Canaanite people, or stay with the people of Israel. And the wife directly tells the Levite, "Hey, we should stay with the Jebusites." And he's like, "No, I'm not going to stay with the Jebusites. Those are the Canaanites. Those are bad people. We need to stay with my people." Well, they stay with his people. However, when they went to this person's house because somebody had offered them a place to stay, they stay in the house. the people who were there, which were, by the way, Israelites, beat and bang on the doors and say, bring out that male guest you have so that way we can know him. And know him in the biblical sense. All right? To know him. And the owner of the house refuses, says, no, why don't we send out my virgin daughter and the concubine? Just please don't violate the man that we've got here, which is very interesting. And eventually the people keep banging and banging on the door. Like I said, these are Israelites that are doing this. People of God, people of Benjamin that's supposed to be doing this, specifically the tribe of Benjamin. This is the people of the tribe of Benjamin who are supposed to be doing this. And they keep banging on the door, whatever. Then they just throw out the concubine, so the Levite's wife, who he had gone all this way to bring back and all this stuff, to redeem to him. Throws her out there. They know her in not good ways, violate her throughout the night, and then leave her on the doorstep of the house for dead, left for dead. The Levite comes out and says, get up, we got to go, like nothing had happened. And she doesn't move because she's dead. So he loads her up on the donkey, takes her away, cuts her into 12 pieces, sends her body parts out to the tribes to let them know what had happened. Then the people are like, this is horrible, because it really was. It was terribly wicked, just to show you the despicable place that the people of God were in. That literally, he had the choice. The concubine said, go to the other people, to the Canaanites, the people that Israel were supposed to drive out. And he says, no, I'm going to stay with my people because they are more righteous and clean. And they're the ones that do this horrible thing. And then the rest of the tribes make war on Benjamin. It's a whole thing. But it's not good. So chapter 17 to 21 show just how immoral Israel had become at this time. Immoral they had become at this time. It is not good. And the thing that's interesting about this, because a lot of archaeologists will look and they will look in Canaan. They will see where now modern day Israel and these different lands where Canaan was in, and they will say, well, listen, how can you say that this was the land of the people of Israel? Because there's just all these foreign gods that we're continuously seeing over and over again. So how could you say that this is the land where the people of Israel were, that they served this one God? But the thing that they're missing is the fact that Israel, for most of its history, I believe, in Israel's history, are they unfaithful more than they are faithful? From what we see in Scripture, it seems that Israel's history, they are more unfaithful than they are unfaithful. So I would say yes. Whether it be in the wilderness, whether it be whenever they get there and they immediately turn back around and they do this whole thing and they disobey and they do this. And then after the time of most of the judges, then you see this thing happen with the tribe of Benjamin and this whole thing. And then finally, once you get to the kings, whenever the kingdoms split and you get the northern kingdom that is just completely immoral for most of their time, they get punished first. The southern kingdom, it's hit or miss whether their king was any kind of righteous or not. And so whenever archaeologists find all these other idols, you'd be like, yeah, that's right. Have you not read the Bible? That's what happens most of the time. People of Israel just kept falling and kept being unfaithful over and over and over again. So of course you're going to find all these gods, these foreign, these false gods, these idols to other gods, and not worshiping Yahweh, because this is exactly the reason why they kept getting punished and over again, because they continued to be unfaithful. And so I think one of the most important reasons to read our Old Testament is to see how God's people failed in the past. And not to fall into the same trap ourselves. And I think it's also important to see this because it's important for us to realize why we needed a Savior. Why we needed Jesus. If the law was good enough, then the law would have been the only thing that God would have given us. But God did not, because he realized, well, it didn't say he realized. He always knew that the law was never going to be enough. It was supposed to be the tutor that led to Christ, not actually salvation in the law. It was always supposed to be the tutor. And the New Testament's very clear on that point. It was always supposed to be a tutor that led us to Christ, led God's people to Christ. And eventually we see that. But man, Israel kept messing up over and over again. It's crazy to see it. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't end here. I mean, eventually Samuel then comes and tries to bring a religious reform with him. And then Saul comes, and we kind of know how that goes. We'll talk about that next week. And then we see David, and good for most of the time, bad some of the time kind of thing. And then Solomon, good for the first half, bad for the second half, everything. And then the whole split. It's a mess for them. And that's why we are in need of Christ. We were always in need of Christ. From the very beginning, Christ was promised in Genesis 3, verse 15. He was always promised. It was always going to happen. And he did come, and now we are all part of spiritual Israel. So we have to make sure that we are not falling into the same pitfalls by making idols in our own lives of different things, by looking to how we can do justice, how we can serve God in the best we can, and not to put too much stock in our own selves and what we do as prideful people. So these are important lessons I think we can learn from these stories in the Old Testament. So I'm going to say a prayer real quick, and then I'm going to let y'all go. Father, we thank you for your revealing word, which teaches us how to be your people. We see the failures of your people in the past, Father, and we see your mercy and your love towards them, Father. We ultimately see your mercy and love in the fact that you sent Jesus, Father, because you could have given up on us many, many times, Father, but you never did. You never did, Father. Even whenever you sent the flood, you still planned on redeeming mankind. Even whenever you sent judgment upon the people of Israel, you always had a plan, Father. And throughout the time of your church, Father, the last 2,000 years, there's been many times when persecution has fallen upon your people, and your people have been put to the sword, Father, but you have always had a plan for your people to redeem us, to be your people, Father, to follow your Son, and to be the people that you call us to be, shining lights in a dark and fallen world, Father. And Father, we just ask your help and blessing in being those people to help us reflect our lights in this world, Father, that really is your light shining through us, Father, and help us to know our word better, to know you better, Father, to love you deeper by continuing to study through your word and singing praises to you and praying to you as often as we can, Father, so that way we can constantly renew ourselves and be continually redeemed by your Son, Father, and by the grace that is given through his death, burial, and resurrection. And please help us to share this good news with all, Father. For your Son's name I pray. Amen. Thank you all. As in the nation of Israel? As in the current political Israel? Or are you saying God's people Israel?